and something where you have a lot of college coaches keeping an eye on things, kind of getting that last look, that last evaluation on some players who are headed to campuses before too terribly long. John Garcia is there, I guess, in Hattiesburg. He covers recruiting for Sports Illustrated and is always kind to spend a few minutes with us. John, what did you see today at practice for, I guess this was day one, right, for Mississippi-Alabama All-Star game?
This is the first full day, the first two a day. They had a night practice to sort of get acquainted with one another. So we split the time today. We saw Alabama in the morning, Mississippi State in the Mississippi in the afternoon. And the takeaway is just the size. The trenches on both rosters are staggering, but especially on Mississippi's, both the O-line and the D-line. They look like an NFL unit right now from a height and weight standpoint. Just doing this over a decade, you see a lot of big bodies, but it's staggering to see how big this Mississippi unit is on both sides of the ball.
Who jumps off the page at you? Is Jahimotis the biggest of all the big guys?
I think he's probably the widest. I think his Twitter profile lists himself at 285. I think he's being a bit generous there on social media. An extremely wide, true nose guard interior lineman. But from an overall height and wingspan standpoint, I think there's a couple other guys that really capture your attention. Jacarius Clayton from Tupelo, extremely long, just has kind of a dream frame for either an offensive tackle or a defensive lineman, depending on how that shakes out there in the SEC West. And when you scan the roster, you see 6'8", and you kind of do a double take. You're like, hold on. And then you see Xavier Harris in person, and he is every bit of 6'8". If you tower over Jahimotis, you're incredibly tall, and that's what Harris does on the hoof. So just unbelievable size there on the Mississippi roster. But I think Harris was the most striking at 6'8", 350.
John, what are you looking at right now as we are a week away from the early signing period beginning as it pertains specifically to Mississippi State and Ole Miss?
I think both classes are going to be a little bit smaller than we're used to seeing. The old conventional rule of 25 guys in the SEC, I think is going to be, for a lot of programs, not just Ole Miss and State, I think is going to be a little bit shorter. I think there's more room for transfers. I think there's more room for perhaps February signatures as some prospects like Bryson Hurst, the Ole Miss commit, is talking about waiting until February. I think Trevion Williams, the elite pass rusher, who's another guy physically, my goodness, 6'4", 250, carries it like a college junior would carry that kind of weight. He's still undecided between several schools. I could see him pushing things to February. So I think all of the coaching shuffle in general in college football is causing a little bit of pause with some of these top recruits because there's still a lot to be settled, and you're expected to sign the morning of December 15th, which as of this moment is less than a week away. So I think, for the kids that are just looking at the Egg Bowl rivals, it's a little bit more cut and dry, not as much transition. But when you start including other programs like some of these kids are down the stretch, it gets a little bit hectic. So I could see a little bit of a pause developing, not only in Mississippi but beyond.
Pick your cliche, John. Hard to put the toothpaste back in the tube, unintended consequences, whatever. But it feels like part of the result of moving National Signing Day up and creating this early signing period has been more early transition with coaching staffs. And we're hearing more and more people go, well, we may have to take a look at this. Is there any going back? Is there any thought that, really maybe February was the right time? Or what if we just did away with the signing day altogether and made it when you're ready to offer and take a kid's signature, you can do it, they can do it? Are either of those options possible?
I think both are possible. I just think they have their own hurdles, established for either route. If you're talking about offering and signing a kid virtually on the spot, I think you have to build in some very hard boundaries in terms of the earliest you can do that. And there has to be some kind of grace period. For me, for a kid who signs and then is locked in for at least one scholarship year, his freshman year, in theory, of college football or any other college sport. I think that would be a lot. If you think of, local kid, a Tupelo kid gets an offer from state, let's say, and he's just excited and he's like, hey, I'll sign right now. I could see issues with that. And then obviously doing away with it altogether would create maybe more time for prospects to make these final decisions. But now you're cutting out about half of the kids who sign early because they're enrolling early. So now all of a sudden they're just walking on and rolling right into a school after they graduate high school in December. I think the early enrollee trend of 10 years ago that is now the majority of kids, I think that was maybe one of the bigger catalysts for the early signing period altogether, because these kids were just enrolling and there was a lot of drama at that stage of the process. So I think no matter how you slice it, there's going to be a change it. There's still a big adjustment period. And for a lot of these kids, when you couple it with the carousel and the transfer portal, there's an adjustment being made even, 5-6 years later, however long it's been since the early signing period was established.
John, we mentioned Jahimotis a couple of minutes ago. Committed to Alabama, took an official visit, I think, last week to Ole Miss. There's some question as to whether or not he's going to go to Mississippi State this weekend or he's going to go to Alabama this weekend. Do you have a prediction at this point? Do you have a gut feeling as to how it ultimately works out, how it ends up?
Being around Jaheim, talking to him just briefly, there is sort of a comfort with Alabama in talking to him. But, the old rule that I was taught when I got into the business was to track the visits, not necessarily the words that come out of a teenager's mouth, depending on the time. So if you track the visits, I think Ole Miss probably has a little bit of momentum compared to both Alabama and Mississippi State. But if he gets on campus somewhere this weekend, I think that's where you put a lot of stock, because you're talking about leaving a college campus some 72 hours before signing your name on a national letter of intent. So I think if he goes back to Bama, that tells you a lot about where he's signing on Wednesday. And if he goes to Mississippi State, he goes to Starkville, I think the Bulldogs are kind of a sneaky dark horse in this race. But just briefly connecting with his camp, it feels like there is quite a bit of comfort with Alabama, despite a lot of trips to other schools, including many to Ole Miss.
Is there any drama out there? I mean, is there anybody that you look at and you go, man, this is going to be weird all the way to the end? Uh-oh. Did we lose John? Oh, I was really looking forward to the answer to that question. There he is. John, we lost you just for a second. I don't know if you heard the question or not. I was just curious if you thought that there was a kid or a couple of them that we thought may have some drama in this one. This thing really may go to the very end.
I think Trevion Williams is probably that kid. Even when he was committed to Florida State, I thought there was going to be a whole lot of Egg Bowl pressure on him late in the game, especially being a defensive lineman. That's just one of those positions that seems to be uber hard for out-of-state programs to recruit. So even after he decommits from Florida State, we hear a lot of Mississippi State buzz, and that's probably still where it's held. But we hear Auburn, we hear Ole Miss, we hear some other programs swinging here late in the game. So I think there could be some drama there. And I think what becomes more important for him is the timeline. Are you 100% sure on signing next Wednesday? And I think there's some movement potentially there. So that's something we're going to have to double check on him later in the week, because, these plans can change here in a hurry. So that's where my eyes are in this state. Now that Kamari Rogers seems pretty solid to Miami. He's talking about getting back down there for a visit this weekend to see the new staff. So Rogers to Miami has held through the coaching transition, but you never know. I think if he does change his mind, Mississippi State is absolutely in the best position.
A week from today, John, we will we'll have a lot of this in the rearview mirror, but certainly there's going to be some stuff in February and some guys that inevitably push it back a little bit farther. Thanks, as always, for your time. Hope you have a great week.
Always a pleasure being on with you and being in this great state. Thanks for having me back on.